Good evening. I thought there somewhere along the way I had mentioned that we would probably be doing all of our classes via video. If I was not clear, I'm sorry for that. My mind doesn't always work right these days, but we will be doing all of our classes up to the final. Possibly we will meet for the final, but I will let you know between now and then what we're going to do for that. Now, I want to do chapters 5 and 6 this evening. And chapter 5 is about theistic arguments. Bertrand, Bertrand Russell, an atheist, he was an atheist, he was asked why he had no belief in God. That was the question. His answer, there just wasn't enough evidence. Implicitly, there at least has to be a certain amount of evidence to believe in God. Explicitly, he says there is not. There are those who believe that Russell, unlike Russell, there could be a belief in God, not from evidence, but from religious experience. Not that you don't believe in God because you can't see God or touch God, but because you can experience God. Because of so much that takes place in this world, people ask for propositional evidence. It's the evidence that pretty much centers around a person's belief in God. There is a good evidence for the existence of God, so we ask the question, what is that evidence? We're going to talk about ontological arguments, ontological, ontological arguments. There are two broad and divided arguments for God's existence. Posteriori, I'll spell it out, Posteriori arguments. We come to believe and know that God, through the experience that we have with Him in this world around us. This argument appeals on the face of the argument itself, that the universe had an origin. If the universe had an origin, then there had to be a divine being behind it. Some divine being had to design it. Then there's the priori arguments. One can know something can be one can know something to be truly implying by thinking about those things. Ontological arguments fall into this category. Not one single ontological argument, but rather a class or a group of sub-arguments. The priori arguments have one thing in common. They work to prove the existence of God. They work to prove the existence of God over and opposed to the mere concept of God. Or even the mere idea that one can just think of God, and therefore there is a God. Although many philosophers consider ontological arguments to be wild and outrageous, if you will. Ontological arguments go all the way back to the 11th century and a Christian theologian by the name of Anselm of Canterbury. These are Anselm's arguments. God is the greatest conceivable being. God exists in the understanding. To exist in reality is better than merely to exist in understanding. If God exists only in understanding, then we can conceive of something greater than God, namely a being just like God, but who also exists in reality. But it is impossible to conceive of a being that is greater than God, than the greatest conceivable being. Thus, it is impossible that God exists only in our understanding. That means God exists in reality as God does in the understanding. Therefore, as Anselm would say, God exists. It goes around a circle and comes up to the conclusion that God does exist. The author of the book, he talks about omnipotent or an all-powerful and an omniscient or all-knowing. But the writer leaves out the omnipresent, the idea that God is always with us. Simply, living in our minds, is what the writers of the book say. There's a concept that the Holy Spirit lives in our minds and our hearts, and our souls. Rene Descartes was a philosopher in the 17th century, and he gave a somewhat greater concept of this. Descartes defines God as being a being who contained all perfections. God was, and is, and always will be perfect. Descartes made the following arguments. God is the greatest possible being. The greatest possible being possesses every perfection that would make them great. Existence is a perfection that would make being great. God possesses existence. And anything that possesses existence exists, therefore God exists. Now, there were people on the other side of the aisle who would argue with these ideas and objections, especially to Anselm. Gaunilo, Gaunilo, disagreed with Anselm. In fact, in his response, he called his writings a defense of a fool. He called Anselm a fool. His argument was this: the lost island is the greatest possible island. The greatest possible island is the island that possesses every perfection. Existence is a perfection that would make that island better. The lost island possesses existence, so therefore the lost island exists. But in reality, that does not sink Anselm's argument. Most philosophers and the theologians do not believe like Galileo. There were other objections. Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T, criticized Anselm, saying once that he was giving some properties. He said Anselm was giving some properties that we presuppose the existence of something. Now, most philosophers believe Kant was wrong, and most philosophers objected to his ideas. Many would offer the idea that existence is a property of something. If something exists, it has property. Existence is the property of being. For centuries, there have been critics of Anselm and critics of Descartes. But in the more modern times, there have been new ideas and new authors who have called new discoveries. They are more known for their modal logic, M-O-D-A-L. It is based on the logic of possibility and the logic of necessity. These two represent true and false. Let's talk about modal ontological arguments. But to understand this whole concept, it includes everything that has happened, everything that is now happening, and everything that will happen. In truth, it also includes what has happened, is happening, and again, whatever will happen on all planets. This is maximally comprehensive because it basically includes everything that ever was, is, and ever will be. Maximally comprehensive description of our universe is called actual world. It basically says there are many possibilities, but only one possibility is chosen. You can choose to stay home and read a book, or you can go hiking with your friends. You know you have to stay home and finish the book because you're going to have a test on one of the chapters. So hiking is a possibility in the actual world, but you know what you need to do. Now, if something were to exist in every possible world, it would exist no matter how things went or how they turned out. For such a being, it would be called necessary being. Processing properties, necessary and contingently. Doesn't matter if a being is one or other of these properties that a being will possess in any world. They possess in any world. It means they exist. Let's talk about necessary being. When something exists in every possible world. Then finally, in the modal argument, there is the concept of possessing all properties necessarily and contingently. Whether a being is necessary or contingent, these properties they will possess in both of these worlds. Example, say Arnold Schwarzenegger is a person. He's just over 6 feet tall. Now, that is necessary in the sense that in any world, he would be a person. But the statement would also be contingent depending on the other world. From all this, we can kind of formulate a modal ontological argument. God is the greatest possible being. The greatest possible being is one that possesses all perfections necessary. Necessary existence is perfection. It is possible for the greatest possible being to exist. It is possible for the greatest possible being exist, then that being it exists necessarily, God exists necessarily, God exists. The premises of this argument, we might go like this. The greatest possible being would be one that is omnipotent and impeccable. But people will say that you can't have both qualities. An impeccable being cannot sin, while an omnipotent being can do anything. They say the perfect being is impossible. The posteriori arguments, there are many cosmological arguments. They all begin with the fact that there are contingent truths, but these require some explanations. Think about this. You go out and you pull some poison ivy from your flower bed. And a few days later, you wake up and you find some small red dots all over your arms. What would explain the red dot, the red bumps? Possibly the poison ivy, but it could be the shellfish that you ate the evening before. Then you find out that you're allergic to the shellfish. Or it could be the mosquito that bit you the other day. We may not know what caused the bumps, but we know something has to explain them. Nothing happens. You say this again, nothing happens without a reason. Contingent requires an explanation. There are two arguments for this thinking. First, the dependence version. A dependent being is one who depends for their existence on something else. A self-explaining being does not depend on anything or anyone else for existence. This explains its own existence, and that is God. The second dependence version. Every being is either dependent or necessary, and not every being can be dependent. Therefore, at least one necessary being exists, and we call that God. Another version of cosmological arguments is called the column version, K-A-L-A-M. This one finds its roots in the Islamic philosophy. Whatever begins to exist is a cause of its coming to exist. The universe can begin to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause for its coming to existence. In other words, something brought everything into existence. This out of nothing is what we normally refer to as ex nihilo. E-X, new word, N-I-H-I-L-O, ex nihilo. Meaning it's Latin for out of nothing. The author of the book gives some interesting arguments. He says in the universe, if the universe had a beginning in time, that means that there was a moment in the universe, and thus if there is a cause of the coming into existence of the universe, this cause cannot have preceded the existence of the universe in time. What that means is this: how can the universe be caused to come to be if the cause did not exist before it? God had to exist before creation. There are basically two design arguments. There has to be an explanation behind what exists. The creator, who is independent and timeless, who exists over and above creation, all things created point to a design creator. Two classical versions. The universe is like a machine. Machines are basically and typically caused by designers. Therefore, the universe, according to some people, is likely caused by a designer. But there are some flaws in this argument. It is not easy to think about creation like a machine. What if the machine were made by a mad scientist? The writers of the book propose that this design argument is one that is filled with flaws. When one uses the design explanation, there has to be something or some other considerations or other explanations that we might also tell us what really happened. With creation, the two most common arguments are chance and evolution. Chance and evolution. It all happened by chance, and there is no real explanation of that. It just happened. There's no rationale. It just happened. There's evolution. Evolution explains from design, at least from natural selection, organisms designed over time adjust to their environment. There are new and more recent arguments for the design not based on chance or evolution. This is the attention given to the apparent design of things according to cosmology. Cosmology believes everything is fine-tuned. Fred Hoyle, Hoyle, an atheist, said, "A common sense interpretation of the fact suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, chemistry, and biology, and there are blind forces worth speaking of in nature." Now, speaking of theistic arguments, let's talk about anti-theistic arguments. People who are kind of new to philosophy of religion believe there's something wrong trying to come up with arguments about, against the existence of God. The question can be asked, how can you prove the non-existence of something? Our writers of the book say there are ways or reasons to believe in the non-existence of something, and that could also include God. Number one, showing non-existence of God by showing the thing described as impossible. If someone tells you they have a round square in their pocket, if someone tells you they have a round square in their pocket, you know that's impossible because there's no such thing. Round has no corners, and squares do have corners, so they're not round. The argument is impossible. Showing non-existence is to look at telltale signs of something that is absent. Example. An example would be the weather. If there had been thunderstorms last night, your driveway would be wet in the morning. The dry driveway provides us with the evidence of non-existing storms. There are two arguments that seem to go on with this. One is evil, and the other is hiddenness. Argument from evil says that if there was a God, if there really was a God, then there would be good and no evil. The world would be evil-free. If not, there's no God. The argument from hiddenness, if God were all loving, God would want to make his existence clear by showing himself to his creation. The third argument is through an appeal to the lack of evidence of the existence of God. Philosophy and law say absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because you don't have evidence does not mean it doesn't exist. Pope Benedict XVI, visiting a concentration camp in Germany, was at a loss for words over what he saw. Richard Cohen of the Washington Post also spoke about that. Theists and atheists are both convinced that evil does exist. It does count against its existence of God. The question is, how can a divine plan, according to atheists, how can a divine plan take into consideration senseless torture, degrading sexual abuse, catastrophic weather events, tornadoes, tsunamis, earthquakes, hurricanes, etc.? As many people look at the state of the world, there's so many questions in our minds. Is there a God? Existence of evil flat out shows in many people's mind that there is no God. Good and evil for them are not incompatible, but in fact there is evil, makes it more likely that God does not exist. Philosophers call the first argument a logical argument. The second argument is an evidential argument. So let's talk about the logical argument. This is not a difficult argument to construct. It might flow like this. If there were a God, there would be no evil. So there is evil, and there is no God. This is the simplest argument for sure, but it hinges on the first proposition. If there were a God, then God would be all good and all powerful and all knowing. And if he was that, then everything he could do to prevent evil. There's the enhanced version of the argument. If there were a God, he would be omniscient, omnipotent, and totally good. And a totally good being would want to prevent evil. An omniscient God would already know about these evils. An omnipotent God would be able to prevent these evils. Thus, if there were a God, there would be no evil, but there is evil, therefore there is no God. The argument gives reason to believe that God and evil cannot coexist. Let me repeat that. There are those who believe that God and evil cannot coexist. There are philosophers who completely reject the first premise. God is not all-powerful. God is not all-knowing. They believe that God is very powerful, but God is not capable of defeating evil. God is very smart, but he falls short of knowing everything. Now, turn attention to the idea of a good being, meaning God will always prevent evil. A good doctor will sometimes cause pain, which we might consider an evil, because doing so is required to get for a greater good, a cure, for instance. Getting a shot may be painful for a little while, but it helps us in the end. That leads one to believe that a good God does not prevent every evil it can, but rather prevents evil unless there is some morally reason to permit the evil. 3 conditions for this to happen. The necessity condition, the good that might come by allowing evil outweighs evil itself. The outweighing condition, the good brought will once again outweigh the evil. And the right condition is within the rights of the one permitting the evil to permit it at all. Simply put, it is within God's power to allow evil. Now, imagine God is faced with creating the universe. God wants to maximize the good of the creation, and also God wants to fill the creation with all types of good. So God creates a number of creatures who have free choice. Can God create a world containing a whole group of creatures with free choice? Could God create a world where everything had free choice, and in turn, those creatures would not choose evil? Alvin Plantinga, Plantinga, wrote a book called Free Will Defense. This argument is supposed to show that there are, for all we know, some good things like the good and freedom of choice. But even God cannot make this happen without allowing certain of evils to occur. The authors point out that evil is permitted. Evil is permitted in order to bring about greater goodness. Atheists believe there are some evils that are so horrendous that no one, including God, is justified in allowing those acts to happen. I think about that. And I think Think about the Jeffrey Dahmers, the child molesters. It has its merits, but the whole concept of logical argument is one that is defended so much these days.